Keep doing that. That floating. I hit record.
Okay.
All right. And
oh, I just had to consent.
all right. We're go.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Jankowskis, Curator of Art at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts, and I'm happy you can join us tonight for our creative conversations. Tonight, we are speaking with artists Susan Lee-Chun and Lizabeth Rossof, two artists whose works are part of the current exhibition, Blow Up, Inflatable Contemporary Art. This exhibition was organized by the Bedford Gallery at the Lesher Center for the Arts at Walnut Creek, California. And it takes the idea of inflatables, something that we're all really familiar with. If you think about seasonal lawn decor or, those waving stick figures that are at car dealerships, and turning those ideas and just completely on its head. The artists in the exhibition use materials and fabric and air in inventive ways to create large-scale sculptures that often provide thinly veiled critiques of pop culture, social norms, and current issues. We also want to thank our sponsors, River Region Parents, Dr. Lori Wheel and Tommy Wool, and Carolyn and Dr. Alfred J. Newman Jr., along with co-sponsors Peggy and Maurice Mussifer, Camille Elavash Hill and Inchill, and Harmon Dennis Bradshaw Inc. for enabling us to bring this wonderful exhibition to the River Region. As I mentioned, we're really happy to have both Lizabeth and Susan here with us tonight to reflect upon their works in the exhibition and share how they fit within their practice. Susan Lee-Chun is a Korean-American visual and performance artist. She was born in Seoul, grew up in Chicago, and currently lives and works in Miami. She has exhibited and performed throughout the United States and abroad at such venues as the Pacific Asia Museum, Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art, the Museo de Arte de El Salvador, the Asian Film Festival Berlin, the Perez Art Museum, and she was just telling me that she is currently included in a show at PS1 in New York. She's also has work included in the permanent collections of the Miami Art Museum and the Museum of Contemporary Art North Miami, among others. She earned her MA from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago and her BFA from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Lizabeth Rossof was also raised in Chicago and currently lives and works in Denver. She earned her MFA in New Practices in Conceptual and Information Arts at San Francisco State University. She has completed residencies at the Montalvo Center for the Arts and Anderson's Ranch Art Center and was awarded residencies at the Cité Internationale de Paris and Centre des Arts Marnay in France. Lizabeth has exhibited her work in Berlin, Chicago, Los Angeles, Melbourne, Miami, New York, Oaxaca, Osaka, Aspen, and the National Center for Contemporary Art in Moscow. Thank you both for joining us. So what I thought we would do is look at some of the images from the work installed in our galleries in the exhibition, and then also talk about some of your other pieces and how they all work together, as well as some of the overlapping themes between both of your works. So let's go ahead and start with Susan. And this is your work in the exhibition, entitled Flamingos Only Hang by the Pool. And your work often addresses cultural stereotypes. In earlier pieces that I'm familiar with, you were really working with your identity and ideas of assimilation and otherness, invisibility or not. Here, I think you're kind of turning your attention more to the identity of a place. Can you talk about why you've made that shift and what you're specifically interested in exploring, and why you chose to use flamingos to do that?
So flamingos, to speak specifically about the work in the show, there were a series of works that came about that I had been invited to create a body of work that was site specific. And, for me, I've been living in Miami for about 15 years now, having moved here from Chicago. And I still say recently, although 15 years is not recent. But I think having been here, a lot of how I've discovered Miami is through this process of almost like as an archaeologist or even anthropologist of kind of trying to decipher so many cues and ideas from the culture. And the culture is very diverse in a specific way. And I feel like Miami was really interesting how certain things that necessarily weren't, it was very tourist based. So objects or the history of Miami that was very relevant to today was very much based on the tourism. And I found that, based on the tourism element, things became so whimsical. And a lot of my work has always been very specific towards finding like, things that were, or gravitating things or ideas that are very tongue-in-cheek, had some humor within the thread of thinking. And, the body of work that culminated through this investigation was like the flamingos. And in one of the slides, there are different types of flamingos that I had found, and they're more pool-based elements, and they were like, sequestered to a very tight space. And I feel like that's kind of how Miami is. It doesn't really give much room for an expansion of outside of tourism because it's such a large part of the economy. And even the t-shirts that are part of this series were much about like the t-shirts that one would find in these like very widely spread, like they're almost on every corner on South Beach or in these areas that are very much populated by tourism or tourists. And the t-shirts were something that I wanted to exaggerate, such as the flamingos. And that's kind of where the work came about. And I think a large part of where personally for my body of work, it started with being very, very specific to my identity. But I realized like expanding the conversation or the dialogue with artifacts that I would come across that people could really access was really interesting. For those, we all can kind of like equate the flamingos that have they're not, they're not specific to Miami. They were placed here, and, by way of Miami Vice, they became this kind of icon, and symbolize a large part of what Miami is, but they're not, part of Miami's habitat. So I think those are things like the authenticity is really interesting, what really belongs to a city, but what we borrow and then, label as being part of, a space's identity or a person or a group. So,
yeah. I think that's really interesting how, we assign identities to certain places or even to people versus how we might
Right.
self-identify, and I think that your work kind of weaves in between those kind of ideas too.
Yeah, and I think, a large part of it is just trying to access as much viewership. And I think this is where Lizabeth and I, we connect, where humor or just taking something very familiar.
Yes.
And, it just so happens that our sensibilities or our kind of mindsets are within these, within this train of thought of being like, oh, I find this kind of humorous. And let's kind of exploit that, and let's use that as a way to draw in viewers, and really have a, conversation that's more possible,
Yeah. Well, let's look at your piece in the exhibition, Lizabeth. This is, of course, the 5 Xi'an American warriors, and with the detail on the right of the Homer Simpson warrior. And like Susan, as she mentioned, I think that she used a good term, sort of anthropology, and I think you are using that idea as well. And you're also, as she mentioned, tapping into something familiar. You know, this was the first time you've actually worked with an inflatable before, but this is not new subject matter for you. You actually began working with your own versions of the Xi'an Warriors in 2009, I believe. So you've kind of been going in depth with them, and you can tell us some more, but from what I understand, they're sort of interchangeable, some of these bodies with the different heads that you have chosen. Can you talk about how this series came into being? And I'm particularly interested in how you're subverting ideas of copyright and cultural property too. I think that that's really a key component to this work. You know, certainly China has that reputation for counterfeiting imagery and also often stealing intellectual property. So how do those ideas fit into this body of work for you?
Yeah, I wanted to circle back with what Susan said about the anthropology and almost archaeology and this documentation. I often think about our current society, our current the things that we produce as being future ruins, right? Like all of our stuff is going to be found by the next intellectual living forms on this planet, whether they arrive here or they evolve. But they're going to find Walmarts, and they're going to find Targets, and they're going to find museums, and they may not really understand the difference. The way that they write our history could be exactly the same. And so with the Xi'an Warriors, they're all over the world in replica and in souvenir and in tchotchke. So when this next intelligent life form inhabits our planet, will they be able to understand the difference between the archaeological site, which then also has a whole other history of controversy around whether or not they are authentically as old as they have been proclaimed to be. So I wanted to, in my original sculptures, they're made in Xi'an, of the earth that all of the other souvenirs are made out of. What's that? Oh yeah, there, that's great. Yeah, so that slide. So they're, souvenir height. So they're anywhere from like 13 to 18 inches high. And the souvenir shops just have 5 molds for 5 bodies. And they have a couple different faces, but it's just 5 molds. Like, you really can't find other ones unless you go to like a really specialized souvenir shop. And I'm just like thinking, like, P.F. Chang's has like massive oversized, the horseman, like, which is not represented here, which is one of the statues, like outside of P.F. Chang's, man, that's fiberglass, like all over North America. It's just like ridiculous. Like, what is the next I wish I could interview the next intelligent life just for their perspective on these particular statues, these particular forms. And so taking the 5 different bodies, I really was at the time interested in like the most copyright infringed cartoon characters. And then I also, at the time, there's not as many different media organizations in just the past 11 years, but it had been, Universal, Fox, Disney, whatever the other ones were at the time. And I sort of wanted to, Marvel, I wanted to hit like each one and look at those characters that are recognizable all over the world and that are imitated all over the world in tchotchke, but also in contemporary art, right? I mean, Mickey Mouse, all these characters have been mirrored and morphed and played off of on all levels of art, right? So that was really sort of that, just sort of pushing what I could get away with, and getting them produced in Xi'an. So again, if you were going to carbon test them or run some diagnostics on the material, it would match that of all the souvenirs that are all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe some new history will be invented about them.
Mm-hmm. So can you share a little bit what led you to actually creating these figures? What was your inspiration?
Yeah. There was an article in The Onion, and it was just this joke about how like this tomb of Walt Disney had been discovered, where he had his likeness built upon the shoulders of the Xi'an warriors, and they had just uncovered it, and it was like the latest archaeological site was, which I think maybe was also sort of winking toward the authenticity of the history around the Xi'an warriors, because they just sort of appeared, and it's been a little cagey about. And you were telling me that in Montgomery or near Montgomery,
in Troy, yes.
In Troy, there's all these replicas there. And there's a story about the Smithsonian having one of the statues, and they carbon tested in the lab, and they were like, this is brand new. Like, what is this? And they went back to the Chinese Anthropological Committee, and they were like, you thought we would give you an original? Like, of course we're not going to give you an original. Why would we let an original out of the country? So it's just really fascinating to think about it.
And you've been
and
there.
All
You've
those
seen
questions.
the originals.
Yes, so I have. Went there. I actually started working with a family that makes souvenirs before I went, about a year and a half before I went, and all of that was handled through Skype and through a translator, and there were some really weird mishaps. I think before there was Spider-Man, there was Ronald McDonald, and he did not translate well at all. So, I mean, unrecognizable. People were like, is that Eazy-E? And I'm like, no, it's Ronald McDonald. So got rid of Ronald McDonald. He was not working out, and the first run of Bart Simpson's almost had like candle holder holes in the tops of their heads. So anyway, it was just a really interesting but fun experience and exercise. Part of what I like is what comes out not the way I anticipated it. And so anyway, I got the opportunity to go to the studio and work directly with the family, and of course did a tour of the archaeological site, and it was just totally disappointing because I had this fantasy since I was a kid and heard about them first as a young person, that I would get to walk through them and admire them, and they would be towering, and it would just be this like, very emotional and connected feeling with these artifacts, and you really just like walk along this catwalk 40 feet above them looking down, and you don't actually get to see any of them. You see some encased in glass, but you never get close to them. But what you do get close to is the like 2 or 3 miles of gift shops radiating from the place, with every kind of Xi'an warrior you could imagine. Xi'an warrior hot sauce, chess sets, keychains, pens, T-shirts, stuffed animals, anything that you can think of, they put a Xi'an warrior on.
So most people's experiences then are actually mediated through these souvenirs versus interacting with the real pieces. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's probably a decent size of the population that just thinks that that's the guy in front of P.F. Chang, like doesn't have any idea that there's, this whole other
history
story behind behind those images.
Yeah. Well, I love that with your work, you have kind of stripped away that one mystery and made it even more approachable than these warriors, but that you can get right up face to face to them, unlike with the original pieces where you can only view them from that upper level. Do you have a favorite of your characters?
I think I have more like favorite head-body combinations than I do favorite characters. Like, I really love when the Mickey is on the Emperor, who is the one with his hand out and is in the robe. Probably because it reminds me of Fantasia. You know, and I get like frustrated when, you know, viewers or collectors are like, oh, the Mickey Mouse. And you know, it's just like, oh, everyone's like, I collect Mickey Mouse things. I want that, you know, and I'm just like, oh, you're missing the point. But then I like reflect on my own opinion. I'm like, it reminds me of Fantasia. It was my favorite movie as a child. That's my favorite. So, you know.
Well, Susan, I wanted to go back and talk a little bit more about, like you said, there was an earlier version of these flamingos that were in this compressed space. You had an exhibition in end of 2018, early 2019, that was in a Windows space, a Windows at Walgreens in Miami Beach. And all of the work, including the t-shirt some of you talked about a little bit earlier, was all oversized, about 10 sizes, increased tenfold about. Can you talk about why it was important for you to enlarge them to that degree and what you were trying to achieve with that shift in scale?
Well, I think, you know, if there's one thing I didn't quite recognize because I was so fascinated by the tourism shops, but that even the Walgreens itself as like a go-to quick space, like to get whatever essentials, that in itself was also a tourism spot, because that's another little venue that wants to come out and you know, be able to like build revenue off of all the tourists coming in. So, you know, oddly enough, like I could walk in and find something that was reminiscent of the items that were there. But the scale, I think, you know, for the most part, being just thinking a lot of even art historically, like thinking about Claes Oldenburg, but just how scale just really does bring about this attention. It demands like kind of this presence because of sheer scale, but also how something very mundane, when exaggerated, becomes even that much more relevant, as saying like, take a closer look at this, see what's actually here, or why we embrace these ideas, or maybe dispel them, or don't just reject them. So I think having that type of attention by sheer size of the works is what I was really drawn to. You know, and again too, I think it does also add this you know, this whimsical factor. You know, so it's, again, I think there's a lot of like just amplification and humor that resonates in those pieces. The flamingos initially, you know, I found to be a really like fun aspect within that tight space, because I couldn't even fit through. And you know, my son and my husband and our youngest, who was strapped onto me on a baby carrier, like I couldn't get in there to like, you know, move them around. So at one point, like my son, without knowingly, like older one, he got squished in between one of the flamingos and the window. and I was like, oh, this is great. Like, this is exactly where, you know, to have that experience, or to people to be able to kind of get that feeling from the enclosed space with the flamingos. You know, and obviously the presence of the flamingos have shifted for this exhibition specifically. But I think, you know, specifically wanting to have the flamingos that were, you know, inspired by the ones that you place your glass cup, you know, on a pool, and, you know, you float around with it. And, you know, this is all about, you know, what we do. You come to Miami, you hit the pools, you hit, you know, your drink, and you set it on a floaty, and, you know, and you're just like, oh, where's that flamingo floaty? And if you see it, you're like, yes, I'm in Miami. And you can check it off as being like, you know, in so many ways, in the like how Elizabeth was saying, like, oh, I went here and I'm experiencing this, and it feels so wrong, but for Miami, I felt like, oh, everyone's going to come here and feel like this is so right. I've had Miami, you know, and I'm good. I can check that off my bucket list, you know.
Right. Now, were these inflatables ones that you had created as well? I know the ones in the exhibition are a little bit different and they were fabricated for the show. Are these fabricated as well per your specs, or were you able to find them?
So these were fabricated based off of flamingo, like, you know, little floaty drink holders that I had found. And then, you know, we handed that model off to the fabricator. So, you know, I think this is also an experience that it's really amazing as an artist to be able to, you know, have this idea and then to work with, you know, another, you know, fabricator or persons that are able to really bring the vision to life, and to have it in this, again, the scale for all of us. The scale is what, you know, in the show, like, defines the piece in so many ways.
Right. And I love that you're playing with scale with these t-shirts too. I think about, you know, you're playing with these remnants of our material culture, going back to what Lizabeth was saying, like, what, you know, would people think of our culture now when they're finding these, like, many centuries from now, these remnants. And you know, here I think with these huge t-shirts too is that, and kind of going back to this idea of identity, if you were to put on one of these t-shirts, it would just overwhelm you, you know, and subsume who you are.
Right.
And you're kind of taking on then this persona of the person wearing this kind of shirt, or the people that do buy t-shirts when they travel, and what kind of person is that versus the people who choose not to buy, you know, these kind of souvenir items, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, there's no way, like, I have a hard time, like, walking by souvenirs when I travel and being like, oh, I just really want to, like, see something, then be able to pick something up. But, you know, then you realize, like, I'm not sure how authentic that is, you know, and that's something that I feel like we all yearn for, and you want something that's more meaningful. But you know, when something that is so commercial takes place of that, you do truly lose sight of this, you know, what could be a very meaningful connection to a place or a site or a set of objects or even a history. And you know, having been here 15 years, like, I realized there's such a, like, there's so much of Miami or South Florida that's unexplored and by the masses. And, you know, I'm just coming to appreciating that. But all these things that are so commodified and commercial.
And kind of kitschy.
Exactly. Kitschy and tchotchke, like all those things that just, like, people are like, oh yes, I want one of those little things hanging on my keychain. I want a, you know, a Pope bottle opener, and you're like, really, like, does that fit? But you know, but it does, like, and people, you know, gravitate towards that.
Well, you know, I think it's interesting, we for our audience, the three of us actually got together and talked through some ideas before having this program. And Lizabeth mentioned something in that conversation, which I think is really relevant to these ideas that we're talking about now. And that's the experiencing things versus living through these mediated objects or photos. You were talking about trying to capture the perfect photo when you were on a trip in a helicopter, and versus actually experiencing it directly. And I think sometimes people are, you know, need these physical reminders of being in a place versus just their own memories, and how that changes when they have those souvenirs versus, you know, reliving it in their heads.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my internet cut out for a second, so I don't think I caught the first part, the very first part of the question.
Well, yeah, I was just saying how, you know, this related to our earlier conversation when you were talking about how you had to take a step back at one point and really have an experience versus trying to work through capturing images and that mediated experience of looking through a camera versus the real life one. Oh, we might have lost her again. Are you there?
Yeah, now I'm back, but I hope I don't know. Was there a question in there?
I was just bringing that up in terms of things that we talked about and that idea of real experiences versus mediated experiences.
Yeah, and the expectation, that I mean, now we have all these places that are Instagrammed, and people are trying to hunt them down, and it's becomes almost like a novelty checkbox. Like, oh, I've been there. I got the selfie. I mean, that's really like pretty phenomenal shift, I think. Although I think a lot of places have always been aspirational to be able to visit, and so like, when do I know I'm in Miami? I know when I'm at the pool with my flamingo, my flamingo drink holder. Like, there's just these things that you're like, that's the experience, because that's what my friend brought back, and that's what their friends brought back, and that's just,
Right. And both of you are bringing the experience to others outside of that place too, which is it adds another layer. But let's look at some of your earlier works, Lizabeth. I think some of the earlier pieces were much more overtly political, whereas with the Xi'an warriors, they're still political, but it's much more subtle. And here, you're looking at both with I Bush, 1,000 Words for Bush, not only politics, but also the commercial advertising and how that has been taking over, and how different brands have identities that are so recognizable. And then again, thinking about things that are recognizable with eyewitness police strides from my memory of the Bush administration, that's all about how we identify with people and what our memories tell us, and what, are recognizable to us. Will you talk us through some of this earlier work of yours and how it relates to what you have been doing for the last few years with the Xi'an warriors?
Sure. So the I Bush project was that I was canvassing people on the street in San Francisco, but then I also went a few miles outside of San Francisco to get a diverse population, political population, and I would just say, hey, can I ask you for a word? And then I'd show them the official presidential portrait, and I'm like, first word that comes to mind, and I would flash this to them. And I probably canvassed, like, I don't know, 1,000 or so people. I had some of my colleagues at graduate school helping me with the project, collecting these words, and it came down to about 300 and some different words out of all of these words that we had collected. And so then I created posters with those words using, I printed posters at a press, and then I vinyl letter transferred the word onto each of the posters. And they were mostly wheat pasted in public spaces. But then I was asked to install them in a few galleries spaces as well, which kind of changed it a little bit. And it was way back when this was the original iPod coloration and look. So the intention was that it would just sort of blend into the rest of the advertising and kind of take you off guard. And then, you see this like I expletive. And you're like, who is that? And then you're like, oh yeah, the Gap teeth. Like, so the only things that were white were his shirt and his teeth. Yeah, just his shirt and his teeth were the only things that were whited out, and the rest was silhouetted. Just like the iPod ad had a silhouetted body, and then just the iPod. Yeah, and then the Eyewitness was a project that I did where I hired police officers who were certified in facial identification drawing to draw from my memory. I approached them and I hired them, and I said I'd like these portraits drawn of friends of my parents who, you know, like kind of haunt me, or I don't even think I said haunt me. I just said like people that I recall from my childhood. So, and so I worked with 12 officers. Each one of them did one of George Bush. And then another member of his administration, the one the slide of is John Bolton. So I like that one because you can see how gray he's gone since that time. Because now he used to have sort of red hair, and now he's got white hair. It's the same glasses and the same mustache. And so, and then instant gratification was a project where I was sort of grappling with like this decision as a young woman. Do I go for like the white picket fence and the manicured lawn and create a domesticity and like plant myself, or, you know, do I venture out into the art career where there's so much uncertainty and, you know, I'd probably end up flying all over the place, you know, because I wouldn't get a tenure track position somewhere. I'd just be adjuncting wherever I could and spending all my money on flights. And so I was just like, well, what if I could just like bring my lawn with me? So I got a piece of grass and traveled throughout Southern California and Arizona and back up to San Francisco with it, just trying to maintain its life, which was a challenge. But and so how those relate back to the more recent work with the Shaolin warriors, I mean, I think it's a play on the things that we find as familiar, and twisting that, or I guess the absurdities in the things that I find so familiar, and exaggerating those things to sort of like make it recognizable how absurd the entire thing is, right? I mean, the fact that we spend so much money taking care of this non-native plant in front of our homes that's usually in a perfect rectangular shape is like totally absurd. Like, we spend tons of money, we hire people to come cut it for us because it's like too much of a bother for us to deal with, but we want it so badly, so we hire other people to come do it for us. Not to mention just the environmental disaster that grass lawns are, but that's like a whole other subject. But, you know, so why couldn't you just, like, if you want the grass so bad, just, like, live your life and take it with you? Yeah. And then with the eyewitness, it was more of, like, you know, all these people's credibility was called into question in the media. So, like, my impression of them was in a way that I had been victimized by them. So wanted to see if my recollection, without studying any of their images, if my recollection could render a drawing that was close to their likeness just through the questioning of those police officers, how they're trained to question and those sorts of things. So.
Well, I feel like with both of you, you're both, you know, somewhat provocateurs in your work. You know, you tend to do it very subtly, but you are kind of putting together, putting forward these ideas that are challenging to how we value different parts of our culture, and asking us to really question and challenge those ideas. Is that your aim?
Yes.
I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's how it just makes more sense for myself as an artist to, you know, I question myself in all of, you know, my thoughts, and I think like it's a great practice to share with the viewers. You know, we're agents of like being able to present these in a visual way that, you know, quite possibly other people may not be able to access or have the time to. And, you know, having that as a motivational factor is, you know, it makes it far more meaningful and transformative in so many ways. And, you know, the dialogue is what we're all after, right?
Right.
Wanting people to have a conversation um, in whatever capacity, you know. It all starts from somewhere, and you know, that's what I feel like is such a powerful, it's a powerful medium, and it's a powerful field that we're very fortunate to be able to be a part of.
Well, I also love how both of you are taking the familiar and using what's familiar in creating works that have a sense of humor. And I think especially in this exhibition, and certainly with our presentation of it, it's so wonderful to have something that will draw people in, attract them because of that familiarity and because of that humor, and challenge their thinking, but also have something, you know, what a crazy year we've had to be able to come and see this show. And we are open now, so I welcome everybody to come into the galleries, but to see this and interact with these works and find, you know, a sense of fun and a little bit of sense of joy. And then if you want to think about these deeper issues, they're there.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, as an institution, or as that, you know, a critical space, you know, having the inflatables, because it's a, you know, going back to what you were saying, Jennifer, is like, it's a very familiar object or concept, and you know, using that as a vehicle to drive in masses or people to come in and view the work, but then also then flip the switch and say, hey, you know, there's something else happening here, on various levels, you know, with every work. And I think, you know, that just seems to be such a way to access viewers, you know, and it works, you know, and I think that's something that many artists, you know, use as a tool in their work. You know, it might be very sublime, but I think for the most part, at least for me, it's one way to get people to, you know, explore the notion of race or identity, you know, things that I find to be like critically relevant today, especially now, you know, and how everything is politicized. And it's something that we have to do. We have to engage in these conversations. There's no walking away anymore, right? Yeah.
Any thoughts, Lizabeth, on how with using humor in your work and that accessibility?
Yeah, I always just think that, you know, that sort of, that punch, that pop, that the laughter sort of pushes open the door to having a more uncomfortable conversation. I don't remember which of the documentaries about comedy that it is, because there's many of them that I've watched. But in the end, one of the comedians is talking, and he says, you know, if at the end of your set you haven't made the audience cry, you haven't done your job. You know, and he was like, and he was talking about how for him, comedy is used as a tool to create empathy, and deeper understanding. You know, and he was really saying that, you know, like he'll have people roaring in laughter and tears of laughter for an hour and a half, but then at the end, if he hasn't made people at least get a lump in their throat, then he doesn't feel like he's done his job. And I think that that's pretty powerful. And in the conversation that we had yesterday, Susan brought up David Chappelle, who's, you know, massive genius, and his work this year has been more important than ever, I think. And he's really the, you know, one of the masters of being able to use humor as a way to really deepen an understanding. And it's uncomfortable, but it's productive.
Right. Well, I think that too, when you are using humor, it eases that uncomfortable feeling because you're more open, you're not defensive, you're willing to kind of take it in and have your ideas challenged and think about something in a different way. And that's what humor allows for.
Yeah, I mean, I think I sometimes feel as though like the the field of comedy is far more embracing towards, you know, as a medium to explore these very like these really difficult topics where, you know, I think a lot of the times for whatever reason, and art history provides that reason, I think, is that um, we're wanting to use art as an escape. And I think that's problematic because, you know, that lends to where a lot of viewers are like, I don't want to come into this space and having to have a conversation or to think. I just want to be able to leave and depart from what is my everyday and experience what's here, and to provide me some kind of solace. But I think, you know, artists that are you know, relevant and more relevant today at this current moment are those that have really have to pound on that, you know, drum and just say like, this is what we need to do, this is what we need to talk about. You know, we see it in like the everyday now, like even with the For Freedoms like billboards. You know, talk about inserting something that's very powerful as a dialogue, an imagery to what the masses could see. And you know, we pass by them so much, but it plants an idea, and I think that's what art should be. And there's a lot of shift and change, I think, that needs to happen. And I think, again, you know, for some of us, like, humor is that way to kind of start to shift that mindset of the viewer. Yeah, I mean, it hits home when, you know, Lizabeth, you were saying like you have to have that emotion come about, like that they have to cry or laugh so heartedly, they have to connect with an artwork emotionally for them to be able to say like, wow, that was moving, that was powerful. But you know, there are so many things that I think don't have to be so, you know, loud. They could just be, you know, just subtle enough, but we have to be open to it.
Right.
So it's, I think a lot of it, there's a lot of work for even artists in trying to lay the groundwork for people to, you know, find what's that subtle, you know, idea that's, you know, traveling within a piece or, you know, within a body of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think, like I said, this exhibition is great for that because it really opens people up. You know, you can come in and spend time and really dive deep into some of the ideas that you all are working with, but it's non-confrontational, which I think is a key thing too, in that it's, you know, bringing people into this space and, you know, allowing them to come to it on their terms, to get to a point where they're not forced into anything, but to enjoy what's on view, go home, think about it, think what it means, you know, and it just kind of opens up to different conversations.
Yeah, and I think I'm pretty aware that, you know, 80% of the people who will see my work won't know about the underlying questions that I have or questions that I'm trying to come up with. And I think for a long time that bothered me. And now it doesn't really bother me that much. I mean, just sort of as Susan was saying, like if it offered, you know, what they were looking for, which was a momentary escape, and maybe it's, you know, I feel like I'm responsible for asking some questions, but I'm not necessarily responsible for providing answers. So, you know, if they're not ready to find the answer or even acknowledge the question, that's okay. Like they liked it.
Yeah.
You know, they want a picture of it because it reminds them of Mickey Mouse and Fantasia. Like I can relate. There's a part of me that's like, yeah, that's the best part of it. So.
Mhm.
I mean, you don't want to shake people and say like, listen, there's something more to this.
I do, but I think I came to terms knowing that like I might not always achieve that with every viewer, and like
But
that's gonna
if
be
you can
okay.
reach some of them, at least
Yeah.
it is hitting some people, you know. Because I think that's true of everything. Not everybody is open to hearing things at any one time. You know, you have to hit people with new ideas when they are receptive to it. So, and humor is a way in, which is great. So, well, when we were talking yesterday, you were both saying that you're at this moment in time with all the difficulties that have happened this year and the pandemic, and you're both just sort of taking time to contemplate and think before you really embark on new bodies of work. Do you think though that it is going to have a big impact on you, the events of this year?
I think if it doesn't, then I think that's a problem. Right? I
So
mean,
you think it will change how you work?
I think so. Or at least like there's just a lot more layers or filters that you know, the ideas will have to, you know, move through. It's not just going to be like, you know, fly by the night of just being like, oh, this is what I want to do. I'm just going to put it out there. I think truly like in every way, if there's something to have been to take away from this period is the idea of, you know, pausing, reflecting, and thinking about where these ideas are coming from and, you know, how they're linked to our history or somebody's histories, and just navigating it through these you know, like tricky layers. And I, you know, I think that's that's part of the process. You know, we have to constantly shift and you know, maybe redefine our practices. And I think that's something I want to embrace, like not even just as an artist, but you know, as a person. You know, as a person, as a participant in this society. I think, you know, we have to. You know, we owe it to the history and the histories of other people, you know, that have been disenfranchised or, you know, suppressed and oppressed, you know.
What about you, Lizabeth?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, I think that you know, as a cisgendered white woman, I've had a lot of reflection on choices and access and my ability to navigate in the world, and not only I guess moving forward, really wanting to acknowledge how to operate in the world in an anti-racist way, right? So like, it's not enough for me to say, well, I'm not a racist because I don't hate anybody, but like really looking at oneself and saying, you know, what have I leveraged in my life? And the fact that I'm a white woman, it certainly comes up. Like it would be completely ignorant for me to think that it hasn't. And so taking a step back and looking at what that means for me as a person who cares about people in the world, like what does that mean for my actions moving forward and how I navigate and potentially the work that I produce or not produce from the ideas that I have, but really, you know, slicing them down and figuring out where they're coming from, and if where they're coming from has a root in any sort of like oppression or um, the privilege, right? Then really examining that and how to move forward from there. You know, just thinking about the woman in Central Park with the camera and the dog, and you know, I'm going to tell the police that there's a black man filming me. You know, that was a super profound moment for me because, you know, my first instinct was like, well, I'm nothing like this person. But then you really have to hold the mirror up closely. And of course, like, I'm more like that person than any other. Or like, she's another white woman my age with a dog. Like, you know, who knows? I don't know how I would have behaved in that situation. And I think it's pretty arrogant for me to think that it would have been so different. Right? I think we have to address those dark pieces, those hidden dark pieces of who we are as people and as a culture to be able to initiate change. So it's been a deep year.
Yeah, I think for everyone. And I think that kind of makes me circle back to where we started this conversation. And honestly, I can't remember which one of you brought up the idea of authenticity. And I think, you know, everything kind of comes back to really this deep dive, being authentic and true to our experiences, other people's experiences, and really look at all of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, I have a hard time thinking about like how there's a lot of work to be done with that, because you know, I think the notion of authenticity is so muddy. It's so grayed now, and not really being able to decipher what is true, real, genuine, because, you know, just even in the works that we create, like that level of genuine, you know, 100% what would be classified as 100% real isn't really, you know, there. None of it's there. It's a fabricated version of something. It's a distant idea that it's become. And yeah, I mean, it's really hard to say like how we can kind of come to that, but there has to be attempts made, right? We have to move towards that. But yeah, I mean, I think that path is really undefined. You know, and I think that's where a lot of, you know, like people are struggling with how do we get to that point, you know, and hopefully there's 8 years moving forward of trying to move towards something. But yeah, it's a good starting point, at least, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, that's the thing. It's
Ayana
going to take a long
2028.
time.
Sorry.
No, but it's true. It's like it's not gonna take, you know, it's not just gonna happen magically. Like we were saying previously, like, oh, when Obama was elected, we were saying like it's post-racial, but truly that wasn't the case. You know, and if anything, it just exacerbated what was existing, and concealed it and buried it. For that matter. So, and look where we are in 2020, right? So, I think things have become very real, you know, and now it's just figuring out what to do with that.
Yes. Well, on that note, you know, it's I think work that everyone needs to do, and you know, we look forward to seeing how it manifests in your art, and you know, all sorts of things can come out of this, and can't wait to see where you both go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It doesn't look like we've actually had any questions come through, but I do want to thank you both for joining me tonight because I think our time is about up. And I also want to invite our audience to join in on Wednesday, December 2nd. My colleague Elizabeth Palmer will be speaking with two other artists in the exhibition, the collaborative team of Friends with You, which is Samuel Borkson and Arturo Sandoval III. So please come back and watch on Facebook Live on Wednesday, December 2nd. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Elizabeth. It's really been fun talking to you tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been great.
And I hope everybody will come into the museum and see the exhibition. Good night.